Tom. Wow.
Yep.
Okay, our next speaker will be Comrade David Sowell, who will talk about the global anti-imperialist struggle. David is a founding member of the Detroit branch and a leader in the Moratorium No Coalition in Macaulay.
Stuff of our pensions committee.
Yes.
Thank you. This month, 100 years ago, marks the beginning of what is now known as the First World War, and among socialists, the First Imperialist World War. However, several years before that, Karl Marx's collaborator Friedrich Engels was already, and Engels lived till 1895. Marx died in around 1882 or so. But Engels lived long enough to see the growth of an enormous military might among the capitalist nations and took note of it. And in fact predicted that there would be a world war among the capitalists. So, and Marx and Engels, of course, are known as the founders of scientific socialism. And the title of our weekend conference has been The Science Behind the Struggle, which we call scientific socialism. And it's not boasting or arrogance that led them to this. They created this attempt to understand the world, which had developed so rapidly in the 1800s, in opposition to the previous thinkers who also espoused socialism, such as Saint-Simon and Fourier and Owens, who are now known as the utopian socialists, because they had a beautiful vision of how things should be, but they didn't really explain how it would come about. So they were seeing the problems of capitalism without seeing a solution because the working class had not developed. And it was Karl Marx and Engels who established the idea that the working class would be the agent of change. And they had developed enough, and union movement had developed enough, so they could see that. And their theories didn't come out of just sitting in a rocking chair on a porch and thinking about it. It came from experience, the experience of the Chartists in England in the 1830s and other movements that gave substance to this. And in any science or attempt to be scientific, you first have to gather a lot of information. And only then can you start to see patterns evolving. And of course, in biology, you can't just go, no one can be a successful biologist and just go out and look at an insect or a plant and how they interact without having some understanding of evolution, the theory of evolution, which links things together. It doesn't mean you have a solution to all problems, but it leads you along to see their interconnectedness of things. Tom made mention of chemistry and how things change, but chemistry has a theory of atoms and a theory of bonds on quantum mechanics, and any chemist who's going to go in the lab needs some of this understanding to make sense of so many things that are happening. And some new stuff evolves or comes up in front of you. You have to see how it fits in with the theory. It doesn't mean the theory has to be perfect or finished, but it certainly covers most of the phenomena. And one of the phenomena that we've seen over the last 100 years, I don't think anybody's seen all of that, but a lot of it, if you're looking at the last history, is the enormous growth of militarism and war in the 20th century into this new millennium. And as I said, Engels had noted it, not living long enough to see the First World War. Lenin, who was the follower for Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the next generation, so to speak, put it in a theoretical work called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and traced that growth of capitalist expansion throughout the world, tentacles for profit making and investments, and which now everyone accepts that that's the nature of the world, and that war follows that, because if you cannot maintain your control, we know they'll make a war on workers at a factory if they go on strike, Well, if a country goes on strike, tries to pull back or limit their profits, they'll go to war against individual leaders of those countries, ruling elites of those countries, or the whole country to subjugate them and to exploit profits. And so how do we approach this phenomenon? There are other theories that people have espoused even 100 years ago. One was that it's human nature to make war. And some people have expanded that or modified it to say that it's male nature to make war, and women should be in charge. But these theories we don't have time to go through them all. And then other people just say, well, the way to fight war is just to declare we'll not fight, we will not fight, we'll be pacifist, and no matter what, all war is bad. So Marxists have tried to understand the economic causes for war, and have shown this, especially imperialism, especially wars in oppressed nations around the world, but also wars between the capitalist powers themselves, such as World War I and World War II, and have developed the concept or shown that war itself is an attempt to solve a problem, and for some people wars are justified, especially in our own era, fighting imperialism, fighting for independence, fighting for national liberation. These are justified wars. Even during the Vietnam War, there was people who opposed all war, including the Vietnamese, and we had to say, no, the U.S. is wrong. We're opposed to the U.S. war, but we support the war of the National Liberation Front and the people of North and South Vietnam to free themselves, and that they fought wars for decades against the French and the Japanese and now the United States for the right to be independent. So we're still seeing the same problems. For a long while, the First World War didn't end until two things happened. First was the capitalists were so busy fighting each other that it gave an opening for the working class of Russia, which later became the Soviet Union, but the working class of Russia to overthrow the capitalists. And Lenin's slogan of turn imperialist war into civil war, class war, succeeded. But only a few years, 1914 to 1917, in those 3 years, tens of millions of people died on the battlefield and in the cities and that sort of thing. Trotsky wrote that those who were opposed to the war I think he was writing around 1915 or so, when they were trying to draft a statement against the war. He said that those who were opposed to the war filled 2 couches. Filled 2 couches. And yet, only a few years before, the powerful Second International of Workers' Association parties had stated, we will shut down all of Europe if there's a war among the European powers. But when the things hit the fan, almost every single one of those parties ended up, as was said earlier in this conference, supporting their own capitalist class. And they found a way to justify it in Marxist terminology as it's a defensive war. They were not the aggressors. And these were huge parties with great thinkers like Karl Kautsky, who was actually the literary heir for Marx and Engels. And yet they all caved in under the pressure and found ways. And so that's really where the division between socialism and communism for that period became expressed, because the social democracy had been the name of all of those parties, and Lenin and those others called it their movement the communist movement, and communist parties grew. The other thing that ended the war, of course, 1 year after the Russian Revolution, in November of 1918, the German workers rose up and overthrew the Kaiser, who had been in power for, the successors had been in power for hundreds of years. And unfortunately, that did not proceed all the way to a socialist revolution, partly because of what we've talked about, the lack of a seasoned organization and leadership that was not able to transform the uprising into a revolution. So the role of communists is very important. As Lenin's party, which was a minority party in Russia, and yet because of their firm opposition to the war and to the capitalist class, they made a revolution that lasted for about 80 years. And we miss them. We miss the successes, even with the distortions that took place. I want to talk, yeah, most of the time. But I want to talk about, is there a future without war? Is that possible? Well, we reject the idea that human nature is warlike. Human beings do have a reflex of fighting if attacked. That's in the brain, hardwired into the brain. But every day we go along, most of the time we don't fight. Most people don't fight. You go to work, if you fight, you're fired. And most people don't get fired for fighting. And we've had a conference here, and I'm sure people have rubbed elbows or sat in somebody else's seat. There's no warlike nature of human beings. This comes out of, some people do that, you know? There's the thing called road rage. So there are people who want to fight or who have anger issues. But overall, war isn't explained from that. It comes from an economic systems or various economic systems. And certainly in this day and age when the wealth of the world, and certainly in this country, the enormous wealth and technology and productivity of agriculture, there's not a scarcity which would compel large numbers of people to fight others over scarce resources. And that's really true for the whole world at this point. There's no need to have these wars and the elimination of capitalism. Wars have not always been capitalist. There was ancient slave systems and there were even some small wars for different tribes, even in hunter-gatherer societies, and then feudalism. But those wars all came from class society. If we can eliminate this class society, these classes, then we can eliminate that class antagonisms and have a cooperative society. Human beings developed for hundreds of thousands of years as cooperative. This is accepted by most anthropologists now, that human beings' nature was not warlike. It was cooperative. That's what's more hardwired into our brains. And so there is no need for a future war. However, there's going to be a lot of war to stop war. There's a Cuban song that says, go forth to make peace with war, because they recognize that you have to liberate humanity from capitalism, and they're not giving up peacefully. And so we have throughout the world, right now it's very one-sided, and yet how can you explain the Palestinian resistance for decades against, it's not against Israel. You look at the Israeli weapons, they are actually U.S. weapons.
Yes.
Tens of billions of dollars of weapons have been handed over to the Israelis, who have become willing tools of the Pentagon. And yet the Palestinians resist and resist and resist heroically, and perhaps will inspire a broader resistance throughout the region. They're besieged right now, but it wouldn't take much for the state of Israel, for the United States itself to be besieged worldwide. The timing of these things does not follow what we want, or even what the people want. Syria right now is besieged. The whole situation in the Middle, I know a lot of people who don't read about the Middle East in the paper. They can't make sense of it. It's very hard to make sense if you don't have a theory of imperialism and capitalism and national resistance. Iraq, what happened in Iraq, and what's going on now with the ISIS organization that's spread from Syria. They were beneficiaries of the United States military aid, because the U.S. is willing to fund anybody, just like Osama bin Laden was, to overthrow a very mildly nationalist regime in Syria, certainly not a communist regime, but yet they were willing to do that, so they bolstered these folks. And now they've invaded Iraq, which the U.S. was trying to stabilize in a different way. And now the U.S., so what's the U.S. solution? The U.S. solution is being floated now on the front pages of the New York Times, is to bomb ISIS in Syria.
Yes.
We can't win against ISIS. First of all, who is the U.S. trying, what is it we're trying, I mean, leave Iraq the fuck alone. You know, nothing good can come of it, but this, if anybody, and I had a friend, a student, I thought he was going to come today, an Iraqi student, young man, and he said, well, ISIS is so bad, I support the U.S. going in there. So, but they created this whole problem in Iraq.
Right.
Nothing good can come from, see, some people call us knee-jerk on these things, but nothing good at this stage can come. The last progressive U.S. war was the Civil War. And progressive in the sense that it overturned an outdated system of chattel slavery. But there's in this day and age, there's nothing good that can come from U.S. intervention. Nothing, absolutely nothing. And so now, and I haven't seen him since this general made these remarks about, and Hagel made some remarks about going into Syria, but that's not about defeating ISIS, that's about defeating Assad. And come what may, they don't care. And the other thing is, and it's been talked about by a lot of people, you know, as bad as British colonialism, and it was brought in with the barrel of a gun, and it oppressed people, and it murdered and slaughtered and enslaved people. That's a pretty bad system, British colonialism. But they had British governors, they built railroads, they built roads, whatever, to further their exploitation, but they had a stable system. The U.S. can't even create that. Well, I think they might want to. They would like to have a stable system under their own hand-picked. They can't do it. In Libya, they could destroy a very progressive regime, and now everyone's fighting everybody, and they, you know, if they can maintain their exploitation of the oil, that's fine, but we're not even sure that that's going to be able to happen. They can't establish any stability in Iraq, in Libya, anywhere that they are successful now. They cannot establish that. We've talked extensively about the military burden on the capitalist class. I want to just end with a question that I don't see dealt with much, and perhaps Marxists need to deal with it a little more. How has this militarism affected the socialist and socialist countries? Where socialism was established in the Soviet Union, China, smaller countries, Cuba, how has it affected them? The need to because they needed to maintain a military structure strong enough to oppose imperialism, which doesn't quit just because they lose. I mean, this, you know, they never stop. From the day the Soviet Union or Russian Revolution took place till the day it fell, they haven't stopped. And they're not even stopping now. Right. They still want to crush it further down. But how did it affect it? The need to maintain a huge military apparatus. Think about Cuba, a small country, totally surrounded by imperialism. And what could they have done if they didn't have to maintain a strong military? How many consumer goods and how much money? I mean, we're proud of what our Cuban comrades have done in healthcare and education. And the Soviet Union, when it existed, how many hundreds of billions of dollars did they have to maintain a nuclear power? It's really what kept them virtually bankrupt all the time. You know, they say, oh, the Soviets don't have VCRs and they don't have enough shoes and fancy clothes or whatever. They probably didn't. I mean, it wasn't the way the imperialists portrayed it, but they didn't necessarily have as much consumer goods because with an economy 1/3 the size of the U.S., they were maintaining an equal amount of military, and we're talking not just about a few guns or AK-47, we're talking about Trident-type submarines and aircraft and space stations and everything else that they had to do, which meant that a lot of other things had to suffer.
And providing military support to the liberation struggle.
That's true too. So, and there are a lot of aspects. What is maintaining, and this is again, just for further or future research. For a socialist country, especially a small country, how does maintaining a large military
Yes.
apparatus, aside from the expense, affect the character of the regime and the social? You have a military, and they have certain characteristics, a certain hierarchy, being under siege, especially small countries, Cuba, some of the Central American countries, whatever, if they're under siege, can you have as much freedom? I mean, can you have as much quote-unquote democracy of any sort? You know, can you let everyone say what they want? I think in the Soviet Union they could have. They were strong enough militarily and economically, but on a small country, you can't just allow anything, because people who are the most organized, getting money funneled from the outside, can start to dominate some of these processes. So it's a distorting factor in the development of socialism until we have and now it's even harder because there's no big socialist camp that can assist smaller countries. But I just wanted to raise that. So, yeah. Anyway, I didn't have too many more points, but it's a great challenge. And the other thing, let's talk a little bit about some of the parties, and then we'll just end there. It seems with all the scientific data that's been collected and the proof of imperialism and its evil nature and capitalist expansion, all of this should be quite self-evident. And I think the people of the United States continually are polled, and they oppose going into Syria, and they oppose going into this country, and that they kind of are fed up with war. They may not know it as imperialist war, but they got a sense, and the U.S. dares not send its own troops to many places in large numbers, because they know, they fear what they call the Vietnam syndrome. Tens of thousands of casualties, not going to be stomached here. So they have to find other cannon fodder to do this fighting. But even without that, we've seen over and over in Libya, the first Iraq War, Libya, second Iraq War, that most of the other anti-war organizations or socialist parties are very weak on this. I mean, the Second International collapsed under the pressure of the World War. These parties are collapsing with almost very little pressure. Just the fact they don't want to tackle this. So even when they opposed the first Iraq War, how many of our yes, they support. The slogan of the moderate anti-war elements, and I think the Communist Party elements were in there too, was "Let sanctions work." That was their slogan.
Yes.
But if you look it up in the law books, sanctions are a form of war. But it was "Let sanctions work." Well, sanctions did work in Iraq. They killed millions of people, mostly children. That was all the moderates, CP elements. Yeah, let sanctions work. And then even when we were in the same demonstrations, I remember. Well, there was one demonstration a week apart. At the beginning was at the
91. Yeah.
91, the first Iraq War. And I think the Communist Party, maybe the Socialist Workers' Party, I don't have all, I didn't have time to research that.
Yeah.
But they marched, and the whole front of it was American flags.
Yeah.
The whole front, yes. No war, but American flags. Well, you're waving the flag of the imperialist monster, the Pentagon's flag. What does that say to the world? And we had one a week later where we had anti-imperialist slogans. But how many times were we told, we're against, by these same forces, we're against the war, not even about saying, we're against the war, but we're up for the overthrow of Saddam Hussein.
Right.
And here it is, they're trying to kill this country, put the foot on the neck of this oppressed nation. Now, we had plenty of criticisms of Saddam Hussein beforehand. But when if the cops are out here beating an African-American young man on the street, are we going to ask, what are your politics, before we intervene? No, the job is to get the imperialists off the neck of these oppressed nations and oppressed people, and we can talk politics later. And that was true in Libya. How many times did we have to have meetings and we could not get any of the other political parties, most of them, with a few exceptions. The Green Party locally was decent on it, but others who did not want to stand up to U.S. imperialism. Oh yeah, we're against the war, but we're also hypocrite. Well, it was over, this is repeated over and over again. So our party plays an important role in a firm anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-U.S. We're like Lenin. We want the defeat of the United States troops everywhere and anywhere. And we're the best friends of those troops because we want them brought home
That's right.
now
Without
and not to be on harm's way. So on that note, I'm going to end and continue our struggle against imperialism.